These files were never meant to be public, but someone reopened them. This is the Dark Bureau. A borderline scratched across a continent in the quiet of a colonial office can determine the outcome of revolutions before a crowd ever gathers. As twilight settled over the British Empire in Africa, the spectacle of independence unfolded with orchestration designed for global headlines, elegant ceremonies, drafted constitutions, and brass bands echoing across plazas. These rituals radiated the promise of emancipation, but their grandeur belied reality. In the penumbra, behind fluttering flags and passionate oratory, a quieter and more consequential game played out, written not in the visible proclamations of nationhood, but in coded cables, private negotiations, and the constant exercise of influence out of sight. The retreat of imperial armies in orderly columns was a performance to distract from the machinations behind closed doors, where Britain's departing rulers and a new elite quietly arranged for power not to vanish, but to morph. Transferred from overt colonial administration to architectures that would quietly persist long after the parades ended and the crowds dispersed. No transfer of power occurs in a vacuum, and the surface calm of those transitions was made possible only by the presence of intricate, shifting networks dedicated to safeguarding interests deemed too vital for daylight. The ceremonial ceding of control masked an intensifying reliance on the less regulated margins between law and profit, order and subversion. Even as documents of sovereignty and independence were drawn up before jubilant crowds, the tools of influence were being updated, not surrendered. Old lines of command transferred to intermediaries, alliances struck between foreign investors and select new leaders, and secret understandings codified in quiet meetings. What appeared as the birth of new democracies was just one front in an elaborate contest, one where the visibility of soldiers and diplomats deflected attention from the construction of durable, sub-rosa institutions. While the handover of constitutions and flags was staged for posterity, another set of agreements, binding in their ambiguity, were cemented to ensure that colonial priorities would not be easily dislodged by local popular will or international reform. Investigating the true terrain beneath official transition papers uncovers a deliberately convoluted web of actors and interests. Teams of mercenary recruiters, their arrivals noted in the logs of distant airports weeks before governors left their posts. Executives brokering deals whose profits and liabilities remained shielded from the incoming parliaments the moment independence was declared. Lawyers and financial consultants who shaped contracts in ways that bound economies to foreign creditors for decades. The newly declassified communications and intelligence summaries produced by Whitehall in these years paint a startling picture. Routes drawn not for neutral administration, but to safeguard access to mineral wealth and the movement of key supplies. Contracts drafted in London row houses and Nairobi boardrooms to ink away resource rights in perpetuity. Hand-picked intermediaries and local elites groomed for pliancy, installed in government as proxies, whose legitimacy came as much from endorsement in coded communiques as from popular support. National borders and new official institutions provided only a thin layer above the more enduring circuits of power, currents structured to preserve advantage, frustrate disruption, and immunize themselves from the scrutiny of international observers. Their very architecture was designed for continuity, resistant to the shocks of rebellion or reform. Mapping these clandestine architectures reveals a mesh of often overlapping and sometimes competing spheres: military, economic, intelligence, and diplomatic. Each governed by its proprietary methods, but united around persistent themes. Fundamental was the economic imperative. For more than a century, Britain's prosperity had been grafted to the reliable extraction of minerals, primary commodities, and energy. Safeguarding access to copper, gold, uranium, and agricultural surplus took precedence, and the gradual withdrawal of formal rule demanded replacement structures that would secure British commercial advantage and block adversary encroachment. Layered on this foundation were the interests of bureaucratic institutions seeking to control narrative, nurture stable successor regimes, and, when possible, insulate themselves against legal or political blowback should clandestine tools ever be dragged into the light. The drawing up of these new blueprints, sometimes in corporate boardrooms bathed in shadow, sometimes in pages of compromised newspapers, sometimes via the precise language of intelligence traffic, spoke to an understanding that true influence would now reside where accountability could least reach. If we search the public archives, what remains are not exhaustive histories, but the shattered evidence of strategies meant to evade detection. Here, a file on a Tanzanian shipping syndicate later revealed to be a supply arm for armed interventions across the continent. There, the run sheet for a Johannesburg consultancy recruitment campaign, masking mercenary hiring under legal veneers. Elsewhere, hasty meeting notes pairing senior intelligence officers with directors from British mining conglomerates to discuss operational continuity after the flags change. The crucial point is scale and design. These were never one-off conspiracies, but overlapping networks that harness the legal tools of commerce, the ambiguity of diplomatic cover, and the secrecy of intelligence methods. No master authority was required. Alliances waxed and waned according to immediate economic or strategic priorities, forming a landscape that was as adaptive as it was opaque. Beyond plausible deniability, the very dispersal of these networks made exposure near impossible without the concerted will of an entire apparatus of oversight, a will that was almost always absent or suppressed. The cultural myth of the mercenary, individualist, rogue actor, romanticised in literature and film, serves to distract from the monotonous institutional reality. Recruitment rarely took place in smoky bars. Instead, candidates moved through professional associations, legal partnerships, and personnel networks cultivated by intermediaries with long histories. Recruitment firms doubling as law officers, psychological warfare experts seconded from Whitehall embedding assets in African and British newspapers, and experienced brokers working the seams of post-colonial legality. Media became a battleground unto itself. Assets cultivated in the press spread disinformation, shaped narratives to delegitimize rivals, and manufactured both unrest and apparent consensus in order to justify further intervention. The system relied less on dramatic personalities and more on the cold math of trust, networks built on shared history, school affiliations, and formation within the colonial bureaucracy, now transferred to the semi-legal shadowlands of decolonised business and politics. The movement of money showcases the blueprints underlying these networks. Financial flows almost never moved bluntly between government accounts. Instead, shell companies provided the rails across which capital instructed as development aid was redirected into operational funds or secret slush pools, routed through clearinghouses in the Caribbean, Switzerland, and the Channel Islands. Multinational contracts written for infrastructure and development routinely encased binding exclusivities, royalty obligations, and liens whose sole purpose was to ensure the new state's dependency on technical and managerial assistance from British or compliant intermediaries. From these arrangements, mineral exports and oil shipments tracked outward, with their profits redirected into logistics, clandestine payrolls, or future leverage. This was not simple misappropriation. It was the deliberate creation of institutional dependency, locking new rulers into a cycle where essential functions of government remained impossible without continued foreign guidance. Institutional power became a balancing act between overt stabilisation, building alliances with cooperative regimes, supporting border security and delivering the appearance of order, and covert destabilisation, often calculated to ensure no rival power, particularly Soviet or American, could easily assume control. Psychological and commercial warfare worked in tandem. State-funded broadcasters seeded narratives that either portrayed stability or orchestrated panic, depending on what suited policy that week. Hidden mercenary teams executed security operations directed as much towards silencing dissent as protecting infrastructure. Meanwhile, front companies, often registered to local proxies or offshore trusts, quietly accumulated stakes in ports, power plants, and critical rail infrastructure. Property that offered leverage for years and decades after the headlines faded. For every outward sign of order, paired covert actions managed risk and manufactured reliance, ultimately shielding former colonial powers from both political and legal consequences. The architecture underpinning this world was adapted from colonial structures, but recast to benefit from the ambiguity of transition. Public and private authority intertwined, the state delegating or outsourcing core functions to entities that were nominally independent, but in practice entwined with overseas or expatriate direction. For new parliaments, judiciaries and civil institutions, this ambiguity proved corrosive. Attempts to investigate or assert oversight were frustrated by tight circles of secrecy, legal obfuscation, and the ever-present threat of retaliation, professional, reputational, or physical. Whistleblowers found themselves isolated or prosecuted, not just for challenging local power, but for threatening arrangements that protected interests hundreds or thousands of miles away. International organisations found it nearly impossible to distinguish genuine reforms from manipulative projects, their fact-finding teams confounded by layers of plausible legality and cooperative diplomatic obstruction. When challenged, Britain's official response was frequently to invoke the spectre of chaos or communist infiltration, deflecting inquiry in the name of regional stability and mobilising international partners to preserve the facade of normalcy. Reform commissions quietly drafted new codes, only for the same old operators to reappear rebranded, if at all, months later. These structures, engineered for resilience, were not indefinitely stable. When relationships frayed or when hidden pipelines failed, be it a critically timed cargo intercepted at a remote airstrip, a security cable leaked by a disgruntled embassy clerk, or a set of business records left behind in a hasty diplomatic evacuation, the system's contradictions lurched into view. The interception of contraband flights or the seizure of files in abandoned consulates could trigger public crises, setting off rapid sequences of institutional turmoil. In such moments of unmasking, national legal systems, generally unprepared for the complexity of decades of covert collusion, were forced into the open. Parliamentary investigations battled with managed leaks. Hasty reforms clashed with ferocious lobbying by new teams of risk consultants and investment lawyers. International competitors, keenly attuned to moments of transitional weakness, moved in with offers of aid, technical assistance, or covert partnerships, each seeking to press advantage and fill the vacuums left by unravelling British networks. Sometimes these efforts produced real exposure and limited reform. More often, they prompted the reconstitution of the original systems under new identities and technical pretexts. The legacies of these hidden networks are neither short-lived nor easily exorcised. The deals forged around mineral corridors, buffer zone security, and media monopolisation quietly dictate the terms of post-colonial economies and politics to this day. Industries founded under the banner of modernisation remain, in practice, foreign-owned or managed. Their profits siphoned overseas even as local governments accumulate debt. Old secret shareholdings and revenue streams leave lingering shadows across contemporary law, with courts and commissions attempting, sometimes in vain, to unwind unrecorded liabilities and hidden debts. Each time new evidence surfaces or investigative journalism exposes another vestige of the system, public trust in legal and political institutions erodes further. Communities still negotiate their future under the weight of spectral presences, not just the colonial officials of past generations, but the active, often undetected intermediaries who succeeded them. Institutions meant to anchor post-colonial sovereignty instead find themselves persistently compromised, fighting to define genuine autonomy against a past that is never truly past. For those determined to expose, reform, or simply understand these deeply buried architectures, the task is more than academic. It is urgent. Systems designed to profit from secrecy resist dissolution, persisting in files, relationships, and rewritten contracts that decades later can determine policy in moments of economic or political crisis. Their incentives, techniques, and connections adapt to new challenges, be it privatisation, deregulation, or digital finance, ensuring that their ghosts quietly shape events even as the official story remains one of emancipation and progress. The greatest danger is not that these networks are illuminated, but that, half seen and half forgotten, they quietly endure, haunting the possibilities for true self-determination and justice, long after the flags have been switched and the pageantry has faded from memory.